I am glad to be able to say that tonight Dan Weidenbenner is here to tell us about his journey, what has brought him to Greenville, and all of the work that he's doing. And I'm grateful that I get to engage with him further and unpack all the wonderful work he's doing. So Dan, you are welcome. You are among friends. We hear you gladly. Come and share with us.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm exhausted. That was amazing. Thanks so much. I've never had an introduction quite that impressive, so thank you, Pastor Matt. I'm happy to be here at Augusta Road Baptist, and so I just want to share a little bit of my story and talk specifically a little bit about Mill Village Farms and how I have found urban farming to be a vehicle for healing ourselves and our community. And so I want to start with sharing what I've learned through my journey. And so I want to talk about a little bit of my history. So I grew up living here in South Florida, to living and going to school here at Furman University, and then moving and living here in the greater Sullivan neighborhood in this home behind Greenville High School. So as you can imagine, it was a pretty intense change that forced me on a path to grapple with this dichotomy of environments. And this decision was absolutely motivated by my faith. So I should back up and begin with where the seed of this idea came. I grew up with two German Catholic parents that grew up in the attics of southern Indiana farmhouses. Although they grew up mostly in poverty and didn't attend college, they had a relentless work ethic mixed with some really good fortune and certainly a system that worked really well for them. They were able to achieve a pretty, I think, incredibly comfortable lifestyle for me and my sister, but albeit it was not perfect. We had a lot of pain. My parents had a pretty awful divorce, and then I largely grew up with a single father. But I found great comfort and meaning through my faith. Especially in my teenage years, that I think really saved me from my own stupidity. But it was a faith that largely kept my worldview fairly narrow. I remember being on a mission trip in college, and a pastor shared with me about how God's image and his faith was reflected throughout the world in the diversity of cultures. After that experience, I ended up moving and living with an African-American couple that were pastors and community organizers in the low country of South Carolina in Allendale County, which is one of the top 10 poorest counties in the United States. But when I came back to my life in Greenville, I found that I was surrounded by God's image and his face that largely looked just like mine: white, upper middle class, and male. So what began with a little curiosity of learning more about God's image has brought me here to my calling. So I want to share a little bit of history of what has become my new home in the greater Sullivan community, a history you might not be aware of, or more affectionately, the neighborhood is called by my neighbors the Butler Sullivan or maybe Dean Sullivan neighborhood. It's actually just walking distance, I think about 15-20 minute walk from here, just further down on Augusta Street. And it was birthed by hardworking, mostly working class African Americans that had hopes and dreams of a better future in the early 1900s. And our neighborhood, as you know, is surrounded by old textile mills, a remnant of an economic boom for our region that brought better paying jobs and opportunity. But however, during the height of this era of economic boom for our region, my neighbors were systematically not hired. So most, as you know, African Americans were not largely employed by textile mills. But nevertheless, our neighborhood was bustling with activity, where families cared for other families, and they had loads of personal investment, passion, and pride. Our neighborhood, in fact, had the first community center ever built in the city. And we still have a community park that's still actively used today behind Greenville High. We have vibrant and historic churches, one that was actually found over 90 years ago by the joining together of two actual homes to create a church in our neighborhood. And our church is thriving more than ever and helping meet many of the physical and the spiritual needs of this community. And this incredible legacy still exists and thrives today. We have neighbors who take care of neighbors. In fact, one of my favorite stories to share is I have a neighbor that I learned early on cooks a huge meal every Sunday to feed her entire block. Many folks, low-income seniors or residents or even homeless folks that live in abandoned homes in our community. But our neighborhood was birthed in a Jim Crow era South, where many of my neighbors were educated in vibrant schools, yet I think unfairly underfunded by our school district. In fact, one of those African American schools lived directly across the street from my house, which you saw in the picture, the Sullivan School. Schools in our community, as you know, were not integrated until 1970. This was about 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And by the 1980s, 90% of African Americans across our district were bused to schools not in their own backyard. In fact, this legacy still exists today. My neighborhood, as I said, sits in the shadows of Greenville High, is actually zoned for Wade Hampton High on the other side of town. And so through my time in Sullivan, though, I've learned of some incredible leaders like A.J. Wittenberg and Horace Butler and Ella Mae Logan, who I believe dreamed of a much better future for our community and for our youth. So I want to bring it to present day, though, and share some difficult realities that still exist, where roughly about 1,300 of my neighbors still live today. The unemployment rate in our community is roughly double compared to our region. Nearly 1 in 3 are living in poverty. Compare that to just 3% of where I grew up. And just about half of all kids in our neighborhood are growing up in poverty as well. 32% of our neighbors report being in poor or fair health. Roughly about 42% of my neighborhood is obese, and about 1 in 4 have diabetes. Compare that to just 10% of where I grew up. The businesses largely surrounding my neighborhood largely include dollar stores and junk food and fast food, so you could call our neighborhood a food desert. But back to my journey, I was the suburban, largely privileged white kid moving into a neighborhood with a lot of woefully ignorant assumptions about my neighbors, many of which I'm still confronting today. I remember when I first moved into the neighborhood, several of my neighbors actually thought I was an undercover cop that decided to move onto their block. So let's just say it took some serious time to build some trust. Of what I continued to learn from my neighbors, though, is their incredible hope and their resilience and their strong work ethic. By listening with pastors and parents and community leaders, I learned many of them wanted to work together to solve some of our toughest problems and work together to help build up our youth in our neighborhood. So we began by planting seeds early on in a neighborhood through a small urban garden that could educate and employ teens in our neighborhood. We started with a small urban garden that eventually included a greenhouse that grew to eventually incorporate hydroponics, so we could grow even more food. And eventually we started a suburban and rural farm location to help support the work we were doing in our neighborhood. We began by selling produce in front of our neighborhood church, and it expanded into a mobile market where we could sell more fresh food in more locations at churches and community centers and businesses all across our community. We've begun packaging produce boxes for families now and selling them largely through low-income healthcare clinics. It's all sounding really good, right? I think, but we had some real difficult lessons to learn. When we first worked, we had an early group of teens that I remember working with us. When they received their first summer paycheck, they took that check just down the street to a check cashing store and spent most of it on fireworks. It was largely pretty disappointing, as you would imagine. But what we learned is we began teaching personal finance classes. We brought in bankers and experts to teach the lessons that our teens didn't know. Things like how to open up a bank account, how to save. We learned that many of our students have worthy financial aspirations of saving for college or saving for their first car or even helping out their family with their rent. Chris, a young adult who grew up in our neighborhood, he's actually the third generation to ever grow up in our community. It was clear when he started working, he felt immense responsibility to care for his little sister and his single mom when times were tough. I remember him telling me at a young age of 13, he learned how to drive a vehicle to get his sister to and from school. He often used his paycheck to help his family survive month to month. And it was apparent, though, that he had a God-given passion for helping others, and his path certainly has not been linear as he moved into adulthood. He's had to be resilient. He worked with our organization. He worked with other businesses and restaurants, working at fast food joints, saving money. But I'm happy to share he has a full-time job at the hospital and is working towards becoming a nurse and has his own apartment. But we eventually began teaching things like entrepreneurship. We encouraged our teens to pursue opportunities in our neighborhood where they learned to start their own little micro businesses or their own little side hustles, where they'd mow neighbors' lawns. In fact, we even had a group grow and sell greens to downtown restaurants down the street. We even had another group build a bicycle repair station for their neighbors, for kids in the community that needed bicycle repair. Again, we were feeling like we were on the right track and doing something good. But another lesson we learned, teens don't like to eat vegetables. Surprise, surprise. Even when maybe they help grow it. So we partnered with folks and we brought in chefs, we brought in experts to inspire our teens to cook with some of the fresh produce that we were growing at our farm. We began teaching health education. We've been educating about culinary skills and wellness, all things that seemed like we were going on the right track. But again, we continued to learn. We learned about some of our teens, and we learned about some of the environments that they were in and their schools and their families and some of their own internal dialogues to themselves. We learned about how stress can impact them and their everyday decision making. In fact, how stress can impact how we interact with maybe our peers or our family. So we recently started hosting mindfulness classes. So these classes where we can help equip our youth to stop and take a few deep breaths when they're stressed out before reacting to a situation. Laura, in fact, one of our teens, I remember her telling us this story after the mindfulness class. She had a tough day at school. As we know, teens have lots of stress going in and out of school. And she rushed home to the pantry to look for a quick fix junk food snack. And she told us she stopped, she took a few deep breaths, and she chose otherwise. And this might seem really small, but I think what we have realized, it's how these tiny, I think seemingly meaningless decisions can impact us for the rest of our lives. So through all of this work of growing food and growing jobs, we have learned that it absolutely takes a holistic approach where there's mutual exchange for learning and sharing, especially with youth that come from a variety of different backgrounds. And we've learned that an urban farm can be just the place where we can learn from one another, exchanging ideas and passions and interests while growing food for our neighbors. We've seen how farming and gardening can be a common bond to unite us with our land and with our neighbors. We've seen how real-life paid work coupled with mentors and training can really be a productive path forward for our students. We've learned that cultivating a nourishing environment through God's help, I think we can help heal one another in our neighborhood. Personally, though, what I have learned is that we can't change our neighborhood or our city without first believing and I think behaving like we are inextricably linked to one another. Especially without focusing, I think, on the rapidly growing wealth disparity that exists within our own city. I think many of us know this. The area median income over the past 20 years has continued to be on the rise. Meanwhile, over that same time, poverty has grown over 60%. In fact, we've learned that Greenville County, of over 3,000 counties across the country, is the 24th worst place in the United States for a youth to rise up out of poverty. So I think the American dream is clearly not working here in Greenville. And I've come to discover that I think Jesus is working in the midst, though, of the often overlooked in our community in really powerful ways. I've seen how we each tend to read scriptures and the Bible from our own vantage points, whether we sit maybe on the proverbial top of the food chain or whether we sit on the bottom of that food chain, struggling to meet our daily needs. And when we come to view God's story through the lens of another, I think it becomes really clear about how God's work in the world around us is so much more vast and expansive than I think our narrow minds can comprehend. I've come to understand that diversity, I think, is the only path forward for us to usher in the kingdom of God here in our town. I share one of Jesus' final prayers in John's gospel to drive home this point. That's been really encouraging for me. I'm going to read it for you. I know it might be tough to read on the screen here. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one. I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. I've come, I think, at this point in my life to fully believe that I think Jesus' ministry was absolutely incarnational. We call Jesus Emmanuel, God with us, and that his ministry was very physical and was very present, I think, in the actual needs of our communities. It was very political. In fact, it was very controversial. It was definitely in the weeds, but it was absolutely in the grass tops, making systemic change. Jesus' ministry was absolutely present, I think, in the good times, but I think even more apparent was his ministry to heal the brokenhearted, to empower the poor, and to those who are suffering. And I think we all know this. I find this true in my own life, of how much closer God is to us in our own personal times of need and suffering. And it's absolutely true for those in this world that suffer more than we do, that they experience God's love in much, I think, vast ways. And Jesus in Christ, I think, calls us and invites us to alleviate this suffering for all, not just for the ones that I think are closest to us. Jesus proclaims, actually, in his gospel, we studied this actually last night in my house, and I felt like I had to share it. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is really, I think it's this proclamation before he goes out and starts his ministry, and I think many theologians call it his mission statement. I've heard other folks really call it his thesis of the book of Luke. So he opens up, and it's a familiar text, he opens up the scroll of Isaac and reads this text that I'm going to read for you. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So I want to end with sharing a poem written by actually one of our neighborhood youth who has overcome some incredible difficulty after getting to know her story and where she's come from. She shared this poem publicly after working with us last summer, and it gives me some great hope, so I want to share it with you as I conclude. Sprouting out of the ground, we have grown new friendships, built a family of love. It's crazy this is our last day together, like the plants we've pulled out of the ground. You can't fake moments like this. We will try not to forget the bond we have made like the soil, not forgetting to grow organic fruit. Roots from every working arm bedded to the farm, we are the farm keepers. Kids looking for work. What better way to work than being keepers of the great Lord's earth? God has brought us together for a reason, making families, changing people's lives. He has brought us here to change, not only change, but to live the life of the influencers. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing your journey, sharing your ministry, sharing your heart. I'm glad to be able to ask some follow-up questions and dig even deeper because I'm just so inspired by the incarnational aspect of your ministry and all the different things that y'all are doing and all of those who are involved in volunteer roles and other leadership roles and participants and the ways of lives coming together to create something where new life and new growth can come out of places where people might not have seen the potential for that.
Absolutely.
So what I want to start by asking about is moving into the Greater Sullivan neighborhood, becoming a member of Long Branch Baptist Church in particular. You are going into places where you are strategically, I think in some ways perhaps, seeking to be a minority perhaps. And you mentioned the idea of white privilege in your talk just momentarily. And I think that's something that a lot of people are unpacking right now, of what that means, how that has shaped them. And so what I want to start by asking you is how did you make the decision to strategically move into those places and be a member of that church? How has it shaped you, opened your eyes? What have you learned from that specifically that maybe we need to hear from as we sort of tend to be in our silos or in sort of what we often call the Augusta Road bubble, where we come in and kind of are and don't necessarily recognize what's going on around us. So what made you decide to do that? How's that shaped you?
Yeah, I would say I think early on for me, I think it was an initial kind of curiosity. I think there was of the unknown, the understanding of the unknown. So much. I grew up in what you would call an Augusta Road bubble myself, being at Furman and growing up in a very, I think, sheltered suburb in South Florida. And I only knew one way of living and only knew one culture and one way of thinking. And I remember some of these early experiences of living with this African American family who took me in as this outlier, and in this community that was largely filled with minorities, and I became the minority, which was not something that I was used to. And it just became so vibrant and rich, and so fascinating and so rich in, I think, depth of understanding who God is and what he is doing in the world. It helped me see, I think, the gospel in a whole new light that I didn't see before in my own, I think, narrow window of kind of a bubble. And I think it was a selfish interest, to be totally honest, of wanting to know the God that my neighbors who look different from me, I wanted to know that God as well.
Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. I want to get into sort of your sense of calling. I loved in your talk you sort of honed in on the sermon at Nazareth.
Yeah.
Call it the thesis statement.
Yeah.
Call it the inaugural address. You can call it all kinds of things. But where he focuses in on, this is my mission. This is what I've been called to do. I'm proclaiming good news. I'm releasing people from the things that keep them captive.
Yeah.
So sort of the two-part question for you is, what's the good news that you're trying to proclaim through what you're doing at Mill Community Ministries? And then the follow-up is, what are you releasing people from?
Yeah, great question. These are good questions. I could probably spend another hour talking about the answer to
got
that
time.
question. I would say, in my upbringing, and I'll talk a little about this, I think there was this dualistic mindset of kind of the sacred and the secular, and this kind of dualistic mindset of all things holy and good happen in the church, and all things, I think, maybe less than, let's just say, happen outside of the church. And the whole goal was to bring people into the church building and to get people to understand the message of Jesus Christ and the gospel. And I think what I have come to realize, I think, through seeing the gospel through the lens of my neighbors, is that the gospel is so much more rich and more dynamic than just that one narrative. And I think it's a both and. I think God is absolutely saving us from sin, but he is also, I think, saving us from the suffering and the oppression that I think we can get mixed in with, and I think we can be a part of, and how he is alleviating and liberating us from the suffering of this world. And those are very physical things.
Yeah.
We were talking, I think one of the things that I like to think about is that in many ways Christians, and I think the theologians, used the Bible to justify slavery. The same group of Christians that were largely African Americans saw the Bible and the Exodus story of absolutely liberating slaves from actual slavery, and that God was a part of that actual liberation of slaves in the Exodus story, and that African Americans in this community that were legitimately enslaved saw that same part of it being the gospel narrative of Christ came to set them free from their personal sin, and absolutely came to set them free from, I think, the systems that were working against them, and to give them, I think, the ultimate freedom of knowing Christ, but also knowing and being able to provide for their family and have the dignity to know that they were created in God's image.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So take me through, for those of us who may not be in your community, how do we bear witness to those types of things as the church, as individual followers of Christ, recognizing sort of this sense of holistic gospel, that it is not solely about individual salvation. That's sort of the first part, but we also recognize we have a God who's seeking to redeem the whole world in the ways that you've described. So, for the everyday person who may not necessarily be moving into a new neighborhood, may not be starting an urban farm, which I want to talk about, the discernment process for how do you decide urban farming is the way we're going to go, that kind of thing. But what would you say to someone who just says, I just want to be able to bear witness to that holistic gospel just every day? What does that look like?
I think it absolutely, for me, it started with just a basic understanding, and I would say an understanding of the context of the world that we live in, and all context that we live in, not just one. And I think building a relationship with somebody that I think is different from yourself, that maybe had a different upbringing or a different culture or a different family upbringing. I think having a two-way relationship where I think you can share God's image that he has put in you, and that other person can share God's image that they have put in them. That was shaped by, I think, their experiences and what God has given them and their gifts. I think, to me, has exploded my world in many ways to get into the mess that I feel like I'm in now.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, so I want to hear a little bit about the mess that all the work that you're doing, all of the incredible stuff, because I'm interested in some of the words in your mission statement and your sense of vision for where the ministry is going. They're words like thriving and success and transformation, and those words can look different to different people. So as you are leading this organization and therefore leading the different people who are involved in leading others towards success and thriving and transformation, what do those things look like? What does it look like for Greater Sullivan to be successful?
Well, I can tell you early on when we started learning and working just with teenagers and working with just helping them get a job opportunity and help them put money in their pocket. We quickly realized that there is, I think, no silver bullet. No community is successful on one specific attribute. You might have the best housing, but you might have the worst schools, and your community will not be thriving. You could have the best churches and not the best schools, and your community, I think, cannot be thriving. And you could have all the jobs and all the businesses and the best healthcare, but not necessarily have great housing or not have opportunity, and to have disparity. I think what I've come to see is that it takes multiple angles for a community to be successful, and that there is not a silver bullet that is a one-solve issue, and that it takes all things working in unison and in tandem for, I think, a community to be successful. And so why we're also involved in helping our neighbors start businesses, to helping teens find meaning and value and see their image of God in themselves. I think it takes all of these things working together, and it takes community members working together, and that it can't just be one person leading these efforts. It takes all of us leading these efforts, I think, in unison.
Right, definitely. So starting with Mill Village Farm, an urban farm in Greenville, South Carolina, in the west side of Greenville, South Carolina. Now, I know it was sort of two churches that decided that this sort of needed to start, but was the urban farm your idea? Was it their inspiration? Really, tell me a little bit more about the discernment process and choosing that model.
I think the discernment process was, what do we have? What are some of the assets that we have in our community? I think the way a typical nonprofit or an organization or a mission group that comes into a neighborhood comes in and sees the problem first. Let's see what's wrong first, and let's fix that problem. I think what I had mentors and pastors come in and say, what are the gifts? What are the assets? What's the beautiful things that are in the community that you're not seeing? And how can we leverage and take those gifts and those assets and those things that we already have in our court and take advantage of those? And one of those was land. We had a lot of vacant land. We have a lot of vacant parcels in our community. It was something that was available to us. The church in our community owns about 5 acres that largely sits dormant. And then we also had youth. We had youth that wanted to do something. We had youth that needed an opportunity, but they didn't necessarily have any direction. They didn't have folks around them giving them guidance and mentorship. And so we asked, we said, what do you want? And many of them said at the time it was very hard to get a job. They wanted money. They wanted to work. They didn't want to necessarily be in a tutoring program or an after-school program. But they wanted something where they could do and have some sense of responsibility. So we coupled those kind of ideas and we had some skills of farming and gardening, and we coupled those all together. And so I would say it wasn't necessarily this discernment process in a sense of, it was more discerning what we had and what could we do with the gifts that God gave us.
That's good, because I think you're in areas that a lot of people don't focus on, sort of, once again, bringing back sort of the old unseen Greenville conversation, and some things that on paper, in as far as what people project an image of our city nationally, they're not focusing on these neighborhoods and seeing the assets within them. So how are you changing that conversation for the city of Greenville to help people see your neighborhood as an asset where we can, in your words, thrive together? We see ourselves as inextricably connected. We can't get away from the fact we are here together.
Absolutely, and I think neighborhoods all across Greenville are interdependent, and I think understanding that the success of one neighborhood is also the success of another neighborhood. I think early on we thought, okay, grassroots work was the work that we needed to be involved in, and that was what could change communities.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we've largely invested. About 90% of our resources within our organization is doing grassroots community development work with the assets and the gifts and the strengths that we already have. But what we have realized is, just in spite of all of those things, we have grass top issues that are that are out of our control.
Right.
Things like now affordable housing, where many of my neighbors now can't afford to live in the neighborhood that they've called home for 3 generations.
Yep.
And so we have systemic issues that are coming from external forces of, we have a booming economy, and we have one of the most award-winning main streets just within a short walk from our neighborhood. And that's a great thing to have. It's an asset for our neighborhood, but part of the challenge of that is people want to live near that. And
Right.
so we're experiencing, I think, some of the growing pains now within our neighborhood, and our neighbors are feeling it firsthand, and our students are feeling it firsthand.
Right.
And finding a neighborhood that doesn't maybe have a place for them. And I think that's where I feel like it's got to be grass tops. It's got to be leadership focusing, and I think that's where I think we can also, bring legitimacy to neighborhoods, is speaking on behalf of communities that maybe you don't live in, or no one, you don't necessarily live in, but you know that the success of Sullivan also dictates the success of Main Street.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I appreciate that. So tell us a little bit more about all of the varied ministries that you've got. We've heard more about Mill Village Farm, but tell about the Village Wrench, about the Village Launch, about Just Faith. I'm intrigued about that. So share with us a little bit more about that.
So I'll add a little bit more about Village Wrench. That was started through really a group of neighbors that started fixing bikes, and we started seeing how we could maybe take the asset of folks that knew how to fix bikes and the need within our neighborhood for free bike repair, and turn that into a little enterprise. And how could we take that and turn it into a business that could employ more students and I think do more good for our neighbors? And so that's what we did. We created a little bike shop down in West Greenville, where we have youth and master mechanics that work together with volunteers to get, I think, a reliable bike. Mm-hmm. So our neighbor that is depending on a bike to get to work, or to get to healthcare, or to get to the grocery store, can have a real asset to live, I think, a life worthy of, I feel like they've been called to. So and so everything that we've done from the Village Launch, where we're supporting minority entrepreneurs that have largely side hustles to help provide income for their families, we've saw that was an asset, and how could we help support that? And so we bring in volunteers, we bring in experts to help hopefully support these entrepreneurs. And the last thing that we've really been largely focused on is what I call Just Faith Greenville, which is actually part of a national movement based out of Louisville that has really discipled folks, over 25,000 folks across the country, to help make these connections of how does the gospel connect to compassion and to justice and to community transformation. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to support more of these programs at more churches, and how we can have, I think, a more activated and a church that's alive and is impacting and meeting both the spiritual and the physical needs of our neighbors.
Great. Now, in the work that you're doing and the connections you have with people, both the grass tops and the grassroots and all of that, you mentioned the fact that your neighborhood is technically a food desert. You mentioned affordable housing. But if you could speak to the greatest challenge that is facing our community as a whole in Greenville right now, what would it be, and what's your hope for our city?
I think if I were being totally honest, I think part of it is apathy. I think this and this feeling of helplessness, I think runs rampant in my neighborhood and in other neighborhoods, of feeling there's nothing that we can do. And that these are part of changes, of things that are happening. And I think it's happening for folks, what I would say, are at the top of the food chain, at the bottom of the food chain, feeling like we can't change what's happening around us. And I think I just have the fundamental belief that I feel like God has given us the gifts and the skills and the assets, and we have those all in our midst, and how can we restructure and do something different that I think can change our community. So I think an empowerment that we can actually make some change. I think when we read stories and hear about the affordable housing crisis that's happening in Greenville, and that we're thousands and thousands of units short. Greenville, I was just talking with folks at the city, 30% of all the new jobs that are being created in Greenville right now will make less than $24,000 annually, 30% of all new jobs. And to find housing for folks that are making less than that is just about impossible. So how do we expect to thrive, and for businesses and for entrepreneurs and for hotels and restaurants and all of these industries to succeed if we can't meet the workforce demand? So I think the biggest thing is a sense of empowerment, a sense of I can do something and my voice matters. I think might be the biggest challenge that I think is ahead of us.
Well, I'm glad you're working on it. But you've got a lot going on. You are working like crazy. Tell me how you are sustaining your faith and your sense of drive for the work that you're doing in the midst of all of it, so that maybe some of us can take away some tips on how to keep that up for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I certainly have gone through waves, I feel like, as we all do, of waves of burnout and places where we feel like we're absolutely in the center of God's will. And I think balancing that, I think absolutely having balance of work and life is absolutely important. But I would say for me, what keeps me motivated is this idea that this is part of God's work in our world and in our community. I remember when I first learned about the Just Faith program, I heard the founder speak here in Greenville 3 to 4 years ago. And he said, if we're going to have wide arms in our community, we absolutely need to have deep spiritual roots connected to the creator of all of this. And I think that was a mind shift change for me, because I wasn't necessarily finding my deep roots in the church and on Sunday mornings. I was finding it through relationships and community and non-traditional ways. And so I think what I have found is being able to make this bridge and be able to make the connection that part of our work that we spend Monday through Saturday is absolutely part of God's will and God's calling. And how do we see that? And I think I feel like when I was able to make that connection, that this is absolutely part of God's will and God's work, and that the sacred and the secular are no longer separate, that all things are sacred, I think is absolutely motivating.
Yeah, that sense of false dichotomy that we've got wired into us, but recognizing the sacred in the midst of all of that is beautiful. I loved the poem that you quoted, the idea of being the farm keepers. Kids looking for work. What better work could there be than being keepers of the good earth? He called us to be here to change, but not only to change, to live the life of influencers. So I just want to say at the conclusion of things, thank you for the role that you are playing to influence those who will influence us for the future. I'm grateful for your ministry, for your work. It is needed. Keep up the good work. Let us know how we can continue to be involved. Thank you for coming and sharing with us in the midst of all that you have going on. It's been an honor for us to hear from you. So thank you. Let's give Dan a round of applause and say thank you for